Hello everyone, and welcome to another video on our own devices. I'm Jean Messier, and today we're having a look at yet another object that I brought back from my recent trip to Washington, D.C. This is a Civil War cipher cylinder or wheel cipher replica, which I picked up at the gift shop at the Gettysburg National Military Park in Pennsylvania. And if you're ever in the area, I would highly recommend paying it a visit. The National Park Service has done a fantastic job. The museum is great. And the 2-hour guided bus tour of the battlefield was one of the highlights of the entire trip. And another related attraction that I would highly recommend is the NSA's National Cryptologic Museum in Fort Meade, Maryland. Among other things, they actually have a pair of original working Enigma machines that you can actually try out for yourself, which is super cool. Also, all of the interpretive panels are written with a surprising amount of wit and humor. Apparently, the NSA has a great sense of humor. Who knew? But before we go on and discuss this object, first a word from this video's sponsor, Private Internet Access VPN. Now, as we'll see in just a little bit, the Confederacy was very lax with their information security during the Civil War, greatly contributing to their ultimate defeat. And while today we might communicate mainly over the internet rather than telegraph lines, that doesn't mean that data security isn't still very important. And this is where a virtual private network, or VPN, like Private Internet Access, comes in. A VPN hides your IP address and encrypts your internet connection, protecting your data against prying eyes such as government censors, internet service providers, hackers, and yes, even Confederate agents. The perfect way to send your significant other that invite to the theater, because we all know what can happen in theaters. But the usefulness of a VPN goes way beyond simple data security. For example, streaming platforms like Netflix and Disney Plus offer different content in different regions. So say you want to watch Ken Burns' 10-hour documentary on the Civil War, but you happen to live in, say, the UK, well, you can simply change your IP address to the US and watch all the Shelby Foote interview segments your heart could desire. Private Internet Access is the world's most transparent VPN provider, with more than 30 million downloads so far. PIA VPN is available on all major platforms, supports P2P file sharing, and works in 91 countries in all 50 US states, though they can't guarantee that some of them won't succeed. A single subscription allows you to protect an unlimited number of devices, and signing up is risk-free with a 30-day money-back guarantee and 24/7 customer support. And as an added bonus, by using my link in the description, you can get 83% off on Private Internet Access. That's just $2.03 a month, and you also get 4 extra months completely for free. So sign up today and enjoy a new birth of freedom on the internet. Now, while this is packaged and sold as a Civil War cipher cylinder, there's actually no evidence, at least not that I could find, that this particular device was used by either the Union or the Confederacy during that particular conflict. In fact, this seems to be a replica of a much older design that was first described in the 1770s by none other than Thomas Jefferson. However, his version was never built during his lifetime, and his notes on the subject were lost until 1922. However, the same basic design was independently reinvented in 1891 by French cryptographer Etienne Bazial, and again in 1917 by U.S. Army officers Colonel Parker Hitt and Major Joseph Maubon, with their version being officially adopted in 1922 as the M94 in U.S. Army service and the CSP-488 in U.S. Navy service, and this remained in service until 1942. So if we have a closer look at this, we'll see that this consists of 12 independently rotating discs mounted on a common spindle, and each disc has 27 characters printed on the outside, all 26 letters of the alphabet plus an extra character, either a number or a Greek letter. Now, Thomas Jefferson's original design had 36 discs, Bazial's had 20, and the M94 had 25. And while the spindle on this one is fixed, on these other versions, you could actually remove all the discs and rearrange them in any configuration, and this added an extra layer of security. Both the sender and the recipient would have identical code books, which would indicate which configuration of discs that was needed for a particular day. And only when they had configured their cylinders in an identical fashion could they freely communicate. So how this works is you compose your plain text on one row by rotating the disks independently. So for example, I'm going to write out our own devices. And once that's done, you then rotate the cylinder around and you can choose your ciphertext from one of 26 different cipher alphabets. And since this only enciphers 12 letters at a time, you then recompose the next part of the message and start the whole process over again. And each time you should choose a different cipher alphabet, choose the first one and then the second one, or then the fifth one, sixth one, etc. then this will increase the security of the message. Now, what's really clever about this is that unlike a lot of cipher systems, you don't actually need to record or transmit which cipher alphabet you used, because once your recipient has entered the ciphertext in the cylinder and rotates the cylinder around, the overwhelming odds are that only one of the rows will show a full coherent sentence. So again, very clever design because it allows you to increase the security of the cipher itself while minimizing the amount of extra information, the key that you need to transmit to your recipient, information which could be intercepted and compromise the security of the cipher. Yet despite all this, at the end of the day, this is still a simple substitution cipher, albeit a polyalphabetic one, meaning that it is vulnerable to the basic cryptanalytic technique of frequency analysis. So how this works is that you look at the frequency with which certain letters appear in the ciphertext and compare this to the frequency at which certain letters appear in plain text. And so, for example, in English, the 12 most common letters in descending order of frequency are given by the nonsense phrase "etwain sherdlu." And you use this along with other clues, such as certain letters being more likely to be doubled, like double S or double F, or certain letter pairs being more common, like SH or CH, to piece together the original plaintext. And because of this, even ciphers like this can be easily deciphered by a dedicated cryptanalyst within a day or two, or by a modern computer within a couple of hours, minutes, or even seconds. Yet, in actual practice, this didn't turn out to be that much of a problem because ciphers like these were used as tactical ciphers, that is, to send short messages like battle orders, which had a very short half-life, so that by the time the enemy deciphered the message, that information was already out of date. So if you use it in that way, then this is reasonably secure for all intents and purposes. But while the cylinder or wheel cipher wasn't used during the American Civil War, both the Union and the Confederacy made use of a variety of other codes and ciphers during that conflict. And I thought it might be interesting to have a look at some of those in greater detail. But before we do that, just a quick note on terminology, because while the terms cipher and code are often used interchangeably, they actually describe two different concepts. So a code is a means of obfuscating the meaning of part or all of a message, such that it is comprehensible to the intended recipient, but incomprehensible to a potential eavesdropper. So a good example of this is that during the First and Second World Wars, the US military made use of code talkers to send secure communications over telephone and radio. And these code talkers used a code that was developed from a variety of Native American languages, such as Cherokee or more famously Navajo. So how this worked was that letters, numbers, and common military terms were translated into related terms in the chosen Native American language. So for example, in Navajo, Wolachi or ant stood for the letter A, while Lotso or whale stood for battleship. And this code was considered unbreakable because these languages were mostly oral, they weren't written down anywhere, and were all but unknown outside of North America. And even if you managed to translate the words themselves and get the literal meaning, you still had to know what military term or letter this translated to. Military code words in general serve the same purpose. For example, if you were an Allied planner in the lead up to the Operation Overlord invasion in June 1944, you would know that terms like Neptune, Omaha, and Mulberry stood for, respectively, the naval component of the landings, one of the American landing beaches, and an artificial harbor, while a German agent listening in would have no idea what you're talking about. Now, on the other hand, a cipher is an algorithm which is used to scramble either the words or the letters of a message such that it is incomprehensible both to the intended recipient and a potential eavesdropper until the algorithm is reversed to unscramble the message and reveal the plain text. And then a third related term is steganography, which means to hide the message itself rather than encoding or enciphering it, though all methods can be used in combination. So, for example, writing down a message in invisible ink or shrinking it down to a microdot and hiding that on a regular letter are both forms of steganography. Anyway, now that that's out of the way, let's have a look at some Civil War ciphers and codes. Now, while the Union did use a variety of different ciphers, the vast majority of their telegraph communications were protected using something called the Steger root cipher, which was developed in 1861 by Anson Steger, the general superintendent of the Union Telegraph Company, and adopted by the War Office as standard shortly thereafter. And this was a form of transposition cipher. And to show you how this works, let's use an example message sent by General Frederick W. Lander to Major General G.W. McClellan on June 1st, 1861. Sir, my past reputation demands at my hands the right to ascertain the state of the advance. Colonel Crittenden, not desiring to start, I have hired an engine to go up road. Since being superseded by Colonel Crittenden, I must not be held responsible for the success of this division. So the first step in enciphering this message is to draw out a grid whose dimensions are dictated by a particular keyword or commencement word inserted at the beginning of the message. For example, the commencement word telegraph indicates a grid with 8 rows and 7 columns. These keywords and their meanings were listed in a special codebook which was issued to all Union telegraphers. These codebooks also listed the eponymous route by which the plain text was to be inserted into the grid. For example, for the keyword telegraph, you insert the words of the message up the 6th column, then down the 1st, up the 5th, down the 2nd, up the 4th, and down the 3rd. Now this still leaves the 7th column empty, and this is filled with a preselected sequence of null words or blind words used to pad out and further obfuscate the message. And these were typically neutral words that wouldn't alter the meaning of the original message. In this case, profane, cowardly, polite, curse, nasty, kind, just, and kill. But even if you manage to thoroughly scramble the message, if it contains keywords like attack or dawn, names like McClellan or Grant, or locations like Gettysburg, the enemy still might be able to intuit the general meaning of the message from context alone. Thus, the codebooks also contain lists of approved substitute code words or arbitraries, like Glaze for headquarters, Burton for Burnside, Wiley for enemy, Bologna or Bolivia for the US president, and Zodiac or Zebra for punctuation marks like periods. For some reason, however, in this particular example, Colonel Crittenden's name was not obfuscated. I guess he wasn't important enough to be included in the codebooks. Now, once all these substitutions were made, you simply read off all the words in the grid from left to right, top to bottom, inserting the commencement word at the beginning. Now, if the message was significantly longer than the number of spaces in the grid and you couldn't shrink it down sufficiently by removing redundant words, then what you would do is pick another commencement word out of the codebook and use that to encipher the rest of the message, making sure to insert that second commencement word into the middle of the ciphertext in order to tip off the recipient that the key had changed. Now, on the surface, this seems like not a very secure cipher at all, but in reality, although the Confederates were very adept at tapping Union telegraph lines, they never managed to crack the Steger root cipher. And there were two main reasons for this. Number one, the messages were so short that there weren't enough repeating elements for them to figure out the pattern. And second, the Union was very diligent about using code words or arbitraries to hide keywords in the message. So it was almost impossible for an enemy cryptanalyst to figure out the meaning of a message just through context alone. And for this reason, this cipher remained in use until the end of the Civil War. Now, there were other reasons why this cipher was so successful. For example, it was very easy for telegraphists to use, both for encipherment and decipherment. And this is an often ignored aspect of cipher design because a cipher that is tedious to use is going to invite shortcuts and other laziness that can seriously compromise the security of that cipher. Also, because the Steger root cipher used whole recognizable words rather than letter-enciphered gobbledygook, its transmission fidelity over telegraph lines was very high, because if a particular word was garbled in transmission, a good telegrapher could figure out what the original word was supposed to be. Yet despite this, the cipher was not without its flaws, one of the main ones being that there was no way of spelling out key words that didn't have an arbitrary listed in the codebook. So for example, in one instance, the word Gettysburg was spelled out as the individual words get, ties, and large, with large being the official arbitrary for the common place name suffix, burg. Meanwhile, the Confederates used a wide variety of different ciphers and codes, though very few were adopted as official across the entire Confederacy. And these included a number of surprisingly simple substitution ciphers. So, for example, in 1862, General P.G.T. Beauregard made use of the so-called Rot 13 cipher, which is a special version of the Caesar or shift cipher. And this consists of two regular alphabets shifted by a certain number of letters relative to one another. So in the case of Rot 13, they are shifted by 13 letters so that A is enciphered as N, B as O, etc. Now, as you can imagine, this cipher is child's play to decipher using regular frequency analysis. And indeed, Beauregard's message was intercepted by the Union, very quickly deciphered, and the plaintext published in a New York newspaper. Similarly, a Confederate agent named J.H. Kamek, who is based in New York City, used a polyalphabetic hieroglyphic cipher where letters are encoded as symbols rather than other letters, similar to the Wingdings font. But despite this having 6 different cipher alphabets, this was also intercepted, very quickly deciphered, and again published in a newspaper. Now, significantly more secure was the so-called Vigenere Cipher, which was officially adopted by the Confederate government in May 1862 as the Signal Corps cipher or the government cipher, and was widely used by Confederate politicians, commanders, and agents, including, famously, John Wilkes Booth. Now, the Vigenere cipher is named after the 16th century French alchemist and diplomat Blaise de Vigenere, though he was not the one who actually invented it. Indeed, the cipher was first described in 1553 by Italian cryptologist Giovanni Balasso, but its invention was misattributed to Vigenere in the 19th century, and the name just kind of stuck. So the Vigenere cipher is a keyed polyalphabetic cipher, and to use it, you need 2 basic tools. The first is what's known as a tabula recta, which is a 26 by 26 grid of letters where the alphabet is shifted by 1 letter in each row and column, producing 26 different cipher alphabets. The other is an arbitrary keyword known to both the sender and recipient. So to show you how this works, let's say our message is attack the Yanks at dawn, and our code word is Richmond. So the first step would be to write out the keyword over and over again over the plaintext, like this. Then, on the tabula recta, you would choose one axis to represent the keyword and the other to represent the plaintext. Then you would look at each letter pair and find the letter at the intersection of the two. So if we use the y-axis for the keyword and the x-axis for the plaintext, we get the following ciphertext. Now, this can be very tedious to do by hand, so the Confederacy used a number of different mechanical aids to help speed up the encipherment and decipherment process. One of these was simply a tabula recta wrapped around a wooden cylinder with a pair of sliding pointers to make it easier to find the intersection of various letter pairs. Only 2 of these are known to have survived the war, and I was able to see one of them at the Cryptographic Museum in Fort Meade. The other was a flat cipher disk based on the Alberti cipher created in 1467 by Italian architect Leon Battista Alberti. The specific version used by the Confederacy was manufactured by metalworker Francis LaBarre, who fled Washington, D.C. at the outbreak of the war and settled in Richmond, where he was contracted to make medals and cipher disks for the Army of the Confederacy. These disks were made out of brass and had an outer diameter of around 6 centimeters. One alphabet was printed around the outside of the disk, while another was printed on a smaller movable inner disk. Now, this could be used both as a simple polyalphabetic shift cipher or to speed up Vigenere encipherment. So how this worked is that you would align the letter A on the inner disk with the first letter of the keyword on the outer disk, in this case R, then go to the first plaintext letter on the inner disk, in this case A, and read off the ciphertext letter on the outer disk, R. You would then shift the letter A to the next letter in the keyword, I, and repeat the process. Now, the Vigenere cipher is considerably more secure than a regular substitution cipher because the rotating keyword obliterates the relative frequencies of the letters, making it impervious to regular frequency analysis. And indeed, it is often stated that the Vigenere cipher is unbreakable, but that's not actually the case. You see, in 1854, Charles Babbage, the father of modern computing, came up with but did not publish a method for attacking the Vigenere cipher. And in 1863, in the middle of the Civil War, German cryptographer Friedrich Kasiski published an identical method, which is now known as the Kasiski examination. And this takes advantage of the fact that through pure chance alone, the same word or the same set of letters are going to be enciphered by the same letters in the keyword, creating repeating chunks of text throughout the ciphertext. And so by counting the interval between these repeats, you can work out the length of the keyword. And what this allows you to do is arrange the entire message into that number of columns. And each of those columns represents a separate Caesar cipher enciphered by a particular letter of the keyword. And then it's just a matter of simple frequency analysis to break each of those columns in turn and then put together the entire cipher. However, at the time, this method would not have been widely known. It also requires a large amount of ciphertext to work with and is extremely slow and tedious. So if the cipher is being used in a tactical context to send very short messages that expire after a short amount of time, then yes, it is, for all intents and purposes, unbreakable. However, that assumes that you are using it correctly, and spoiler alert, the Confederates did not use it correctly. For example, the Confederates had a habit of only enciphering specific words within a message and sending the rest as plain text. And this meant that Union cryptanalysts were able to often figure out the meaning of those words just through context and counting the letters. Also, the Confederacy only used a handful of keywords throughout the entire war, including Baltimore, Manchester Bluff, Complete Victory, Come Retribution, and my personal favorite, My Old Kentucky Home. And this failure to change their keywords with sufficient frequency meant that once Union cryptanalysts cracked one keyword, they were able to read Confederate communications for months on end until the keyword was finally changed. So what you end up with here is a really weird situation where on the one hand, the Union has an ostensibly weak cipher, which it nonetheless manages to use to great effect because it is very diligent with its code words. Whereas on the other hand, the Confederates had a nigh unbreakable cipher, but managed to squander this advantage through sheer laziness and incompetence, as if you needed any other reasons why the Confederacy lost the war. Now, before we move on, I do want to point out that there is a type of cipher that has been around for quite some time that, when properly designed and used, is absolutely unbreakable. And this is what's known as a one-time pad cipher. So in its ideal form, the key in a one-time pad cipher is completely random, known only to the sender and recipient, is at least as long, if not longer, than the message itself, and is used only once to encipher one message before being discarded and replaced with another key. And if all those conditions are met, the cipher is unbreakable because there is no repeating keyword or any other patterns that a cryptanalyst can exploit to crack the cipher. Anyway, another common code used by the Confederacy, and yes, this was a code and not a cipher, was the so-called book code or dictionary code. And this involves calling out letters in a pre-selected book, typically a dictionary. So for example, if the word you're looking for is ship and this appears as the 26th word on page 126 of your chosen book, then for that word you would write out 12626 or something to that effect. And a number of different books were used for this purpose throughout the Civil War. For example, Confederate President Jefferson Davis communicated with Generals Albert Johnson and Joseph Johnson using a code based on the 1857 edition of Webster's Primary School Pronouncing Dictionary of the English Language, while the Confederate Navy used Cobb's Miniature Lexicon. However, when using a dictionary cipher, you have to be very careful about the specific edition of the book that you're using, because even a slight difference in typesetting can completely ruin the code. Now, finally, the last major cipher used by the Confederacy during the Civil War was the so-called grille. And at its most basic, a grille is a sheet of cardboard or metal, some thin material, with a bunch of windows cut out in it. You would lay this over your piece of paper, write out your message in the windows, and then fill in the rest of the spaces with random letters. And only a recipient with an identical grille can lay it over the message and reveal the plain text. Now, one step above this in terms of security is the so-called rotating grille. And so what you do is you write out part of the message as per usual, but then you rotate the grille 90 degrees, write out letters in the now rotated spaces, and do this all the way through 270 degrees, and then fill in any remaining spaces. And typically what you do is you label the four sides of your matrix as well as the four sides of the grille on both the front and the back, and then indicate on the message somewhere which orientation the grille has to start in order to decipher the message. And one step above that is the so-called keyed rotating grille or Rochford cipher as used by Confederate agent George T. Sinclair, who was sent to the UK to acquire ships for the Confederate Navy. And in this cipher, the message is actually only written in a specific subsection of the entire matrix, the dimensions of which are given by a keyword. For example, for a message sent on August 7th, 1863, Sinclair's keyword was Emily North. And within the message itself, he included the following indicator: EE, IH, EI, MR, N, and Y. And using the keyword, this translates to 11, 30, 13, 28, 6, and 5. Now, the first two number pairs indicate that the area to be used is bounded by columns 11 to 30 and rows 13 to 28. Any letters that appear in the grille from other areas of the grid are ignored. And by the way, the columns and rows on Sinclair's matrix were numbered 11 to 30 instead of 1 to 20 to confuse cryptanalysts. And finally, the last two numbers indicate that the grille starting position is with side 6 facing up, and that it is rotated in the direction that places side 5 facing up next. Now, so far as is known, Sinclair's cipher was never cracked during the actual Civil War, with his keyword and his grille being worked out in the 1970s using a copy of the original plaintext. And that, dear viewers, is a brief summary of the major codes and ciphers of the American Civil War. Now, I acknowledge that this was a very surface-level examination, but unfortunately, the field of cryptography is so vast and fascinating, it's really easy to get sucked down multiple rabbit holes, and I wanted to keep this to a reasonable length. Maybe in the future, I will get my hands on more cryptographic equipment, and we can have a look at some of these cipher systems in more detail. In the meantime, for those of you who are so inclined, please send your solutions to the cipher that I've hidden throughout this entire video to the email appearing below. All the clues you need to solve it are hidden in the video itself. Best of luck. I'll see you next time. I'm Jean Messier from Our Own Devices. Have a great day.